lecture 20, and so we're up to the second to last lecture, basically. It says lecture 23 on the PowerPoint here. It's actually my old lecture 24. Someday I will remember these to be correct. But in any event, I'm going to be talking about the Civil War. And the Civil War, pretty much the most momentous occurrence in American history, almost putting an end to the great experiment in government by, for, and of the people. So I don't kind of have to really go a lot into why do we care about this topic. But I'm going to be talking about the Civil War, not so much in terms of its battles, because this isn't a military history. I'm not a military historian, but rather the sort of causes, the consequences, the significance of the Civil War, and the experience of various groups within the nation that participated in the Civil War. I'm also going to be talking about something that happens in every war that America, which is expansion of government power and expansion of government responsibility. This started off as a war that Lincoln described as a war to unite or reunite the Union. It ended up being a war to free the slaves, with a tremendous impact on soldiers, on enslaved people, on freed African Americans, on the home front, the government, turning the United States into a unified whole from a loose confederation of states. People before the Civil War would say, the United States are blah, blah, blah. The United States are preparing diplomatic representation to Russia or something. After the Civil War, they would say the United States is. So it was a civil war that kind of transformed the United States into a singular noun. The Civil War was also the first modern war. It's the second war to use the telegraph. The first was the war with Mexico. It was the first to use the railroad, the first to use the armored steamship, and the first to use trench warfare. It would also be a precursor to the horrendous casualties of modern conflicts of the 20th century. And Abraham Lincoln, acknowledged by most people to be in the very top tier of American presidents, was the first president to be assassinated in office, although not the first president upon whom there was an assassination attempt. Somebody tried to assassinate Jackson with 2 pistols, both of which misfired. All right, so as I said to you, the southern states, 11 southern states, had split off from the Union. They formed themselves into a government that they called the Confederate States of America. The president of the Confederacy was Jefferson Davis. And the CSA set up a government that was quite similar to the government of the United States of America, with the exception of guaranteeing in the Constitution the institution of slavery. The Confederacy had a Congress, and the Confederate Congress authorized an army of 100,000 men to serve for 12 months. Having kind of established in their minds their own country, the Confederates had just a flood of volunteers to go fight. Communities sent their young men off to war with big parties. They compared the new conflict favorably to the Revolutionary War, said, you know, tyrants are trampling on our liberties and we're going to go fight. The Union, in contrast, called for 75,000 state militiamen to serve for 90 days. So they had a thought that the war was going to be much shorter than the Confederates assumed it was going to be. And again, the outpouring of enthusiasm was so great that some people had to be sent home. There just was not room for all of them. The biggest fear of many of these men was that it would be a short war, and not all of them would have the opportunity to see action before it was over. The young men talked about wanting to see the elephant, which was not a real elephant. The elephant was kind of like the metaphor at the time for the really exciting thing that's going on. You have to remember that the War of 1812, which was the last, war anywhere close to the East Coast, had been 2 generations ago. So few men living were acquainted with the horrors of war, only knew about its glories, and wanted to get in there. Once the war had dragged on for a while, it was harder to find volunteers, and so both sides of the conflict instituted a draft. The South imposed its draft in April of 1862, and the North imposed its in July of 1863. Those between the ages of 18 and 35 were conscripted, but not everybody actually had to go fight. In the South, if you lived on a plantation that had 20 slaves or more, one white man was exempted from fighting for every 20 slaves. Reason being that the Confederacy didn't want to leave all of its plantations just in the hands of women. You could also, on the Union side, buy an exemption for $300. This was called a commutation fee. $300 was 1 year's wages for an artisan. So if you were a working class person, you weren't going to be able to afford to pay the commutation fee. But if you were a very wealthy person, you could probably, pay to have your son not have to serve. You could also hire a substitute. And the substitutes could be hired from any people in the US who were not eligible for the draft. And so that basically meant immigrants who had not declared their intention to be naturalized. So new immigrants from Germany, Ireland, ended up being hired as substitutes. War would be a coming of age experience for these soldiers. Many had not been away from home before. They found life in camp alternately boring and shocking. They were exposed for the first time, a lot of these boys from villages and towns, exposed to vices like prostitution and gambling. They were used to having the calming impact of their mothers and sisters around, but of course the camps were devoid of women. Sometimes the men in camp would have the drummer boys who were teenagers dress up as women for dances, so they'd have somebody to dance with. The life of the common soldier is documented in many letters home that survive from this war, and that's how we know what was going on. Once the soldiers actually had to participate in conflicts, they had casualty rates that were really unprecedented in American history. Why? Several reasons. First of all, the military strategies being used in the Civil War still put a premium on direct attacks. Sort of Napoleonic theories of armed conflict were still in use. Second, rifled guns rather than muskets were used in this war, and rifled barrels make bullets go faster. You could still only get up about 3 shots per minute, but a new soft lead ball called the mini ball was very effective at causing casualties and death because it would become shrapnel in the body. It would separate into a million pieces and really tear up your internal organs. Another reason why the casualties were so high is that there was no notion yet in the United States of antiseptic medical practice. I mean, people didn't even know about bacteria. So once a bullet hit you in an extremity, the cure for that was amputation. Civil War doctors didn't know, for example, that they should clean their tools in between amputating limbs, that they shouldn't wear the same blood-soaked apron to do, 10 leg amputations in a row. The amputations were performed with a hacksaw and without anesthetic. The most important thing was to get it done quickly before the patient went into shock. And at least one doctor took off some of his fingers while attempting to amputate somebody's leg. More men died of disease than of their wounds. And this was a truism in American history right up until World War I. That was where the turning point came. The large number of post-battle casualties meant that people died on the battlefield who, if there had been an ambulance corps, might have been able to be brought to a medic and saved. But instead they would die of thirst and shock or drown in puddles of rain. During the war, some nurses were women, and this was a new thing for American armed forces, but there were still a lot of male nurses. If you wanted to be a female nurse, you had to be matronly, like over the age of 30, be married, because the fear was that if you had younger women and unmarried women working in hospital wards, that their virtue would be sullied in some way by interacting with wounded soldiers. Okay. Any questions? You may be wondering what's going on in the second picture down from the left. The process of embalming, which had not been something that Americans did to their dead before the Civil War, was brought over from France and became a way to preserve bodies that needed to be shipped home. A lot of soldiers who were killed in battle were just buried where they fell. Those areas were later converted into national cemeteries, like Gettysburg National Cemetery. However, some parents wanted their sons to be brought home to be buried in family plots or cemeteries near to home. And so embalming workshops sprang up next to Civil War camps. And embalming, this is when embalming became sort of like a standard practice for the American funeral industry, which had been home-based before that.
I do have a question about that. The home-based funerals, what would they do with, what was the process with the body if you were embalming? Would you just have to bury it?
Yeah, you had to bury it really quickly, within a day, really, and especially in hot weather. And what would be done is midwives generally prepared bodies for burial. They would stuff something into all of the openings of the human body, tie up the jaw with like a big bandage, and the point was to get it into the ground as soon as possible. So that was how it worked up until the Civil War. Then the Civil War, because you can't embalm bodies at home, the Civil War helped to shift American funerals to being in funeral parlors and done by actual funeral professionals. So without the Civil War, I think it would have taken a lot longer for embalming to become super popular.
And has that always been like a standard practice in Europe?
No, it's less popular in Europe than it is in the US. In England, for example, cremation is done in more than half of deaths. That is not the case in the US. I mean, the number has been climbing, but we still are more likely to have open casket funerals, to have a delay before bodies are actually buried. and to have room to inter full human bodies. At the bottom left there, you see some Civil War dead. Matthew Brady was one of the most famous American photographers of the Civil War. And this brought home to Americans, the true impact of some of these battles. And if it wasn't enough to actually see what was left on the battlefield, Brady would drag corpses into the frame to make it more dramatic. So that's the 19th century equivalent of Photoshop, is dragging the corpses around and posing them. I sometimes teach in upper division history course, the history of death in America. So it's kind of like a geeky interest of mine. All right, now I want to talk about battles of the Civil War, but briefly. The only thing I really want you to remember about pre-1863 Civil War battles was that despite early Union confidence that it was going to be a short war and that they were going to win, and despite the North outmanning the South and outgunning the South pulled into the lead, and it really looked like the Union was in trouble. The American public pushed General-in-Chief Winfield Scott to advance on the South in 1861 before his troops were adequately trained. He ordered General Irwin McDowell to advance on Confederate troops at Manassas Junction, Virginia. The way that Civil War battles are named is one side named them after places and one side named them after bodies of water. So First Manassas, Battle of Bull Run, the same battle in July of 1861. McDowell marched his Union troops down there, and they didn't have enough time to rest after having marched to Northern Virginia. Confederate reinforcements arrived, and once the Confederate reinforcements were there and the Union troops were tired, the Confederate soldiers ran out of the woods screaming at the top of their lungs while they were running, and basically scared the crap out of the Union soldiers, who turned around and ran away. Now, the thing about this is that people had come down from Washington, D.C. with picnics to watch what they thought was going to be a Union victory. They were trampled by Union soldiers running the other way. It was a festival atmosphere up until the battle went bad. They always had brass bands marching and drummers drumming in the Civil War battles. So it was like a nice day out until the Union lost. Well, First Manassas set up the situation for how the war was going to go until 1863. The Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee, was especially impressive in terms of its victories, and international observers, especially the English, thought, oh, they're going to win. They are going to be able to wrest independence from the North. The North is going to capitulate and let them go. There were just a couple of bright spots for the Union. That included Ulysses S. Grant successfully concluding the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi in July of 1863. Vicksburg, Mississippi is on the Mississippi River, and Ulysses S. Grant was in charge of Union troops who were trying to cut the South in half by winning control of the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was considered a virtually impenetrable fortress and was the largest obstacle to Union control of the Mississippi. Ulysses S. Grant and his troops began to blockade the city of Vicksburg on November 2nd, 1862, and they besieged Vicksburg until July 4th, 1863. This marked the largest capture, when they won, it was the largest capture of men in arms in history up until that point. The Ulysses S. Grant and the Union captured from the Confederacy 30,000 troops, including 15 generals and 172 cannon. So whereas other campaigns in Virginia that the Union was participating in did not work out so well, this was a turning point for the Union. Now, it looked as though the Confederacy might grab the West, particularly California. The Confederacy had allies in the South. They had the support of Native Americans by promising them representation in the Confederate Congress. And Indian attacks on Union troops soured relationships between Native Americans and the United States. But what ended up securing the West for the Union was the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which has been called the Gettysburg of the West. John Chivington, who was the leader of the first Colorado Volunteers, was a Methodist minister and a big guy who was 6.5 feet tall, 250 pounds, and he sometimes delivered his sermons with a pistol sitting on the pulpit. He was offered a chaplain's commission in the Union Army, but he said he wanted to fight for the Union, not pray for it. And so you have him on the one side. On the other side, you have 3,500 soldiers who were Texas volunteers. And in January of 1862, those soldiers marched into New Mexico. Part of New Mexico had already been captured by the Confederacy, including Mesilla in 1861, and also the Confederate troops had marched through Las Cruces. Anyway, in 1862, these Texas Army guys marched into New Mexico. They skirmished at Valverde, which is near Socorro. And then they seized Albuquerque, plundered Santa Fe, and started moving north toward Colorado. Then they were gonna hang a left and head for California. Their motto was on to San Francisco. Chivington marched 40 miles a day through ice and snow with the first Colorado Volunteers to stop the Texans.
Were the Texans fighting for the Confederacy or the Texas Republic?
The Confederacy. They had joined the United States in 1845, and so from then on they were part of the US, and Texas had seceded, so it was part of the Confederacy. So Chivington and his troops get down to Apache Canyon, and they skirmished with the Confederates, and they slammed away at each other for like 5 hours among the boulders up by Glorieta, which is by Las Vegas, New Mexico. But while this was happening, Chivington had some of his men go 16 miles behind the line, behind the front line, and destroy all of the materials belonging to the Texans. They burned 85 wagons filled with provisions. They bayoneted 500 horses and mules. And the Confederates now were left in the middle of northern New Mexico with no supplies and no way to get anywhere. So they retreated. Out of the 3,500 Texans who had marched into New Mexico, only 1,500, only 2,000 returned. 1,500 never returned. So that was the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Questions so far? Okay. Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in early July 1863, is normally considered to be the turning point of the Civil War. General George McClellan, at this point, was leading Union troops against Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy. Lee had had a couple of victories at Fredericksburg and I forget where else in Maryland, and decided at this point to push for a peace agreement by invading the North. So in July of 1863, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia started to go north into Pennsylvania. He had 75,000 men. General George Meade had the Union Army of the Potomac, which was 97,000 men. And they met at a place called Gettysburg, where they were not expecting to encounter each other. The problem that Lee had, Lee used his cavalry under Jeb Stuart as a kind of espionage operation, you know, to suss out what was going to happen. And Stuart had ridden off in some direction, and Lee couldn't find him, and so he didn't realize he was about to run into a bunch of troops. The battle took place at Gettysburg on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. More men fought and died in that battle than on any other battle before or since on North American soil. I'm not going to say too much about the actual details of the Battle of Gettysburg, because you could talk about it for a whole hour. But I will say this, one of the most famous things that took place at the Battle of Gettysburg was on day 3. The Union troops were on top of a hill. You can see them here in the map. There's Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. And so they were in kind of a good defensive position. If the Confederate troops wanted to take their position, they would have had to, you know, run right up into the artillery fire and break through the Union line. This is in fact what happened on day 3. General George Pickett led a mass infantry assault of 15,000 Confederate troops across an open field toward the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. In 50 minutes, 10,000 of those troops had become casualties. So it was really sort of the worst 50 minutes in the Civil War. With the failure of Pickett's charge, the battle was over. Lee began to retreat with his troops. The town, which had started off with only about 2,000 people living in it, was left with over 50,000 casualties. Over 170,000 men and 630 cannon had been positioned in a 25 square mile area. So you can imagine what it looked like afterwards. It was totally devastated in terms of the environment. There were 5,000 dead horses. There were so many corpses. The Confederate Army staggered away from Gettysburg. The Union general, though, Meade, did not pursue Lee's army to try to finish them off. The Union generals during the Civil War have been criticized for their failure to really go after retreating troops and to try to smush them. But I think that this is explicable by the fact that they were still Americans. You know, it's easier to kill people when you can really dehumanize them and see them as something other than your relatives, your countrymen, etc. After Gettysburg, Lincoln chose Ulysses S. Grant to command all the Union troops, and Grant and then William Tecumseh Sherman would be a lot more rigorous, a lot more likely to wage total warfare. Any questions?
What were the dates of the Gettysburg battle? Sorry.
July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. Okay. So there was a whole bunch of dead bodies at Gettysburg, and they were interred in Gettysburg because it would have been really hard to move them. And so later, in that year, in November, it was decided to make that into a national cemetery. You might as well just say, okay, where we bury people is the cemetery now. The governor of Pennsylvania invited President Lincoln to come down to the consecration of this new cemetery and to make a few appropriate remarks. Lincoln didn't really prepare an address ahead of time. He supposedly wrote it on the back of an envelope while he was traveling to Gettysburg by train from Washington, D.C. The governor of Pennsylvania spoke for 2 hours before it was time for Lincoln to give his address. Nobody remembers what the governor of Pennsylvania said in the 2 hours. But Lincoln's back of the envelope address, which took about 90 seconds to deliver, lived on as an important piece of American rhetoric. So I'm going to read it. fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So pretty good for the back of an envelope, I gotta say. The reason nobody ever forgot the Gettysburg Address is that it went into all the textbooks that American students learned from, and it was something they had to learn to recite. And so for generations, people remembered it. After Gettysburg, it became really clear that the South was going to lose, but it took a while for that to happen. The Southern troops would not surrender until 1865. What happened before then was William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia with a large number of Union troops from Atlanta to Savannah. He marched in a column 50 miles wide, not just going and fighting his way through to Savannah, which is on the Atlantic, but also burning crops, burning houses, and freeing enslaved people. There has been a debate ever since about whether this was a waging of total war in a way that was qualitatively different from the rest of the Civil War, but it was impactful. There started to be a lot of Southern troops going AWOL. Their wives, their families were writing to them saying, the kids are sick, we don't have enough food, the Yankees have taken everything, you really need to come help us. And so there was a tremendous, exodus of Southern troops. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox Courthouse quite close to where the first battle of the Civil War had been fought. He handed his battle sword to Ulysses S. Grant, and as he passed through, his men lined up with tears streaming down his face, he said, "Men, we have fought through this war together. I've done the best that I could for you." So 4 years, not 9 months, not 1 year, the South, the Confederate States of America strung it out for way longer than the Union thought that they would be able to do.
Was it true that it wasn't actually an Appomattox courthouse, it was like in a house next door?
Yeah, yes. The McLean House.
And then, okay, but I've also heard that their house was also part of the first battle that like a cannonball went through.
Yes, in Ken Burns' Civil War. Okay, yeah, the election of 1864, not something that I usually talk about, but it is noteworthy that Lincoln was running against his former general, George McClellan. That McClellan was running for the Northern Democratic Party, and this was the first election in which troops in the field participated in voting. They voted absentee, and they are credited with having given Lincoln the victory, which otherwise would not have gotten, because as you heard, the war was kind of unpopular by 1864. All right, so I talked to you about the general trajectory of the war, and now I'm going to speak thematically about a few things. For Black Americans, this war was a hugely important conflict in ways that we're going to see right now. Southerners were, as you heard in the John Green video, fighting for what they considered to be their own freedom. But African Americans quickly figured out that this was a war in which they could free themselves. Benjamin Butler, a Union general, in 1861 announced that the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was repealed. So what this meant was any enslaved people who escaped to the North were not going to be returned to the South. Butler called the enslaved people who did escape contrabands, by which he meant if they were not returned to the South, then they couldn't help the South. They couldn't help the South by doing the work that the white men couldn't do because they were fighting. So thousands and thousands of African Americans fled to the North starting in 1861. This is what the slaves freed themselves means. It's a thing that historians often say about this. Then the war goes on for a couple of years, and it begins to seem to the United States that one of the biggest factors that might lead to the downfall of the Union is if a foreign country comes into the war on the side of the Confederacy. Britain seemed the most likely country to be able to do this. There were some ties of affinity between the English and the Confederates. The English aristocracy saw kind of themselves mirrored in the plantation aristocracy of the South. And William Gladstone, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's the finance guy in the British government, said very complimentary things about the Confederacy. So Lincoln was like, okay, well, what can I do to make it so that Britain doesn't come into the war? That is why the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January of 1863. Lincoln's initial concern had not been to free the slaves, but rather to save the Union. But the Emancipation Proclamation made it a moral question by freeing the slaves in areas that were in rebellion. So, in other words, the Emancipation Proclamation said, not the slaves in the border states that are part of the Union, but only the states that are in the Confederacy, in those states, the slaves are now free. It's a good way of issuing a proclamation that doesn't really have teeth, because, you know, Union troops were not in charge in those Confederate states, but it accelerated this flood of enslaved people northward, and it gave the Confederacy a reason to come back into the Union. Because as soon as a Confederate state would say, okay, well, we're coming back into the Union, then they would get to keep their slaves. So it was only slaves in areas in rebellion who were free. After the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were welcomed into all Black Union regiments under white commanding officers. They ended up comprising 10% of the Union Army, with nearly 20% of all African American men serving. So a huge proportion of men served. A large proportion of the Union Army was made up of Black people, many of whom had been enslaved. Black soldiers faced unique problems in the Union military. First of all, there was prejudice from fellow soldiers. Because as John Green hinted in the video, many US troops didn't see their participation as, oh, we want to fight to make men free or whatever. They participated because they felt patriotism for their country, or they thought God was on their side of the conflict. And then James McPherson has written in his books that after a short while, men fought for their comrades. You know, they had very fraternal bonds that they developed with their fellow soldiers, and they were fighting for them rather than for any kind of larger idea. So they experienced prejudice from fellow soldiers. If they fell into the hands of the Confederacy, they would be executed or sold into slavery rather than be taken prisoner. African American soldiers were given the worst jobs in camp. They were segregated. And they were paid less than white soldiers. Not only that, there was a two-tier system of payment so that formerly enslaved soldiers were paid less than African Americans who had been free from birth. If you've ever seen the movie Glory with Morgan Freeman and Matthew Broderick, this movie's like from the 1980s. It's a good movie about, oh, and Denzel Washington's in it. It's a good movie about the Black experience in Civil War soldiering, and it talks about the pay strike, or it centers on the pay strike. All right, I'm gonna do one more slide and then we'll stop for the day. On the home front, there was turmoil in both North and South. There were a lot of trade union strikes in the North. And the reason was that the price of goods was going up, inflation was really terrible, but wages were not going up. The inflation rate was like 80% over the 4 years of the war. Tension broke out into open rebellion in July of 1863 during the New York draft riots. As New York instituted its military draft, they actually had a big lottery, you know, in the street with a barrel, like the kind of barrel that mixes up the balls in the Powerball. And they would pull people's names out of that. The people who were being drafted really did not want to fight a war to free the slaves. And so they took it out on African Americans living in New York City by murdering them, burning their houses, burning orphanages, burning hospitals for African Americans. The draft riots, as you heard in the video, lasted 5 days, resulted in 100 people being killed, and only ended when troops from Gettysburg were brought up to the city to put down the riots. In the South, people who didn't fight, people who were still at home, faced prices rising by 9,000%. That is inflation that I can't even imagine. There were food riots in southern cities. Southerners, many of them refused to serve in the army, pay taxes, or supply the troops. And as I mentioned to you, desertion by Confederate troops was a major problem. There was even some consideration in late 1864, early 1865 about whether African Americans should be pressed into military service in the Confederacy. This did not end up happening. That was like a bridge too far for Southern citizens to think about kind of undermining their entire cause by giving African Americans positions in their own army. So they just never did it.
Last thing that I talked about was the Civil War on the home front. And today I'm going to be talking about the rest of my Civil War topics, including how the war centralized American government and what the challenges to American foreign policy during the Civil War were. Okay, so the United States, as I said at the beginning of lecture 24, was a decentralized confederation of states. But after the Civil War, it would become much more a united sort of nation. The Civil War gave the central government so much power that it's harder to imagine now states daring to pull away from it. Although it's funny, you know, that kind of waxes and wanes depending on what's going on in American current events. Soon after Fort Sumter was fired on, a tier of states, an additional tier of states, including Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and South Carolina, joined the Confederacy. And this left 4 border states in which slavery still existed. And these border states remained in the Union. Those border states being Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri. The border states were the region most likely to have families that were split over the question of the war. And Lincoln had to kind of walk a fine line about how to keep these border states in the Union while at the same time, you know, fighting against the Confederacy, which had joined together over the question of slavery. Because the capital of the Confederate States of America was at Richmond, Virginia, and the capital of the Union was at Washington, D.C., it was especially important to keep Maryland in the Union. But there was a lot of strong pro-slavery sentiment in Maryland. And in Baltimore, which is the capital of Maryland, Union troops who marched through early on had stones thrown at them, bottles, saw the Confederate battle flag being waved. Union troops fired on crowds in Baltimore, killing 12 people. And the state of Maryland responded by closing off railroad bridges and destroying the telegraph line to Washington, D.C., cutting off the capital. Lincoln responded to this by declaring martial law and retaining Maryland in the Union by force. Also in connection with Maryland's crisis, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus is the thing that prevents you from being held in jail indefinitely without being charged with a crime. The suspension of this writ meant that you could just lock up troublemakers and hold them in jail indefinitely during the Civil War. All right, so the suspension of civil liberties is one way in which the government's power expanded during the Civil War. Another way was that the US government financed the war by issuing money, issuing paper money using the Legal Tender Act of 1862. This was the first federally issued paper money in the history of the US. State banks could no longer issue their own currency. And the new money was called greenbacks because it was green. Financing the war did not just involve printing paper money. There was also the sale of war bonds, where individuals invest in the government by buying bonds that pay interest. There were sales taxes, and also the first federal income tax. Anyone making over $800 a year had to pay 3% income tax. Okay, so that's another way in which the power of the government is centralized, is through these additional financial steps that were taken. Another key part of provisioning the army was to ensure that there were supplies existing where they were needed. So the government raised taxes, raised tariffs. Federally chartered corporations built a transcontinental railroad, or started building one. It wasn't actually finished until after the Civil War, but the government's support of railroads was an expansion of its power. The Department of Agriculture was formed in 1862 with the intent of making sure that Union farmers were as productive as possible. The Homestead Act, finally, after the national reformers had lobbied for like 20 years, the Homestead Act was finally passed, allowing any head of family 160 acres of public land as long as they would live on it for 5 years and improve it and plant crops. The Morrill Land Grant Act gave states public land to finance land grant colleges that were meant to train working class children in areas such as military science, agriculture, and engineering. All right, so all of these things together represented a huge expansion in the role of the federal government. Another factor that would forge a tighter union during and after the war was the need to present a united front to foreign countries, some of which threatened to intervene in the conflict. This was really only the case until the Battle of Gettysburg. Gettysburg was such an important and decisive battle that other countries were not thinking about supporting the South after the Union had won that battle. Britain was the main country that the Union was worried would support the Confederacy. The population as a whole was anti-slavery, but Britain needed American cotton to run its textile mills. And when the war started and the British could no longer buy Confederate cotton, a thing called the cotton famine struck. And a lot of the factories had to be shut down and people went hungry. There was unrest. As I said the other day, William Gladstone, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the British government, was supportive of the Confederacy. So there was a worry that Britain would come in and support the South. I told you the other day about those cultural connections between UK aristocrats and Southern slave owners. The only thing that the British did end up doing was building warships for the Confederacy. They built these warships in Liverpool, but they didn't outfit them with guns until they were away from British soil, so that they could argue that they hadn't actually intervened in the war on the side of the Confederacy. In fact, these warships were very deadly for Union shipping. The CSS Alabama, in particular, resulted in, due to its successful preying on a number of Union ships. After the war, there was a claim in international maritime court where the British were asked to pay for a lot of the American shipping that they had ended up destroying. France took the opportunity of the United States being distracted with its civil war to invade Mexico. Napoleon III sent a cousin, Maximilian, to assume leadership of the Mexican government. The French threat of possibly invading the United States from the south, however, was stopped when the Union sent troops to Brownsville, Texas, and drew a line there that Napoleon III of France did not encourage crossing. Finally, what were the legacies of the Civil War? Well, it was a huge death toll, first of all. 620,000 soldiers died, more than the nation's combined total in the First and Second World Wars, 25% of the nation's total fighting force. An additional almost 500,000 people were wounded. And when I say wounded, I mean serious wounds. Missing arms, missing legs, having the jaw shot off, just things that required people to have pensions from the government because they were not able to continue working. There was a demographic setback because a lot of the young men who died had not yet formed families. And so there's a huge, what would have been a baby bust, but for the fact that European migration after the Civil War was pretty much unlimited. So European migrants replaced the lost generation of Americans who had been killed in the Civil War. And then finally, the South was economically devastated. A lot of cities had been completely leveled. There were lots of refugees. Of course, as we're going to see in the Reconstruction lecture, the entire labor system of the South was undermined by the freeing of enslaved people, which of course is a great and moral, but it did undermine the prosperity of the South as an agricultural region for reasons that I'm going to explain. All right, so the Civil War, extremely destructive, both personally and economically. Okay. Any questions?